Hey everybody, Robert with RC Archery, and you're watching Tuesday's Tip of the Week number 75. In today's video, we are going to be finishing up the shot execution series with part 4, using the release. This is probably the video that most of you are wanting from the beginning, but I do feel like that there was different parts of what we're building on to where when you're using the release, you need to be able to separate aiming, have a good setup, and have a good understanding of what's going on. So everything is building on to itself, and today we'll finish it out with the way to set up a different release, finger pressures with that release, hand positioning. I'll also talk about the differences between 2, 3, and 4 finger releases. And then at the end of the video, we'll be going over shooting methods, give you some different advice with different releases, and then I'll also have a bonus tip for you at the very end. In our members video today, we'll be talking about topics with our follow through, what we're looking for, and how to use that follow through to be able to diagnose some problems that we've run into, how to fix them, and what those look like. All right, in our first segment here, we're going to be talking about setting up the release and then what we're doing with our hand. Let's start out, let's talk about a wrist strap release, then I'll go into thumb releases, and we'll end up with a hinge release, as I think there's probably the most to talk about with the hinge release, with click versus no click and setting it up and how to use that release. So when we are looking at a wrist strap release, and I apologize that I don't have one today to show you, but there's a couple things that we need to make sure that we're making fitment wise happen within what we're doing. And one is just the strap itself around your wrist. I see too many people that have that wrist strap too loose, and when they're actually drawing the bow back, that strap starts to slide itself up your hand. You don't want it to necessarily slide up your hand very much or at all, because when you're doing that, it's actually going to affect something else that we'll talk about here in the second part of this. But what we'll do is we want to have it tight enough to where it stays at the base of the hand, but not so tight that it's cutting off circulation or you're being uncomfortable for you. A good wrist strap will have a better kind of way to secure it here, whether it's Velcro or whether it's a buckle style or something, you know, different like that. But whatever it may be, you want to make sure that you are adjusting it and taking care of that. I do see some people, they'll wear almost like one of those cotton wristbands that you wear sometimes, keep sweat from running down your hand. That helps keep that wrist strap from sliding up your hand or having anything crazy happen. But make sure it's staying at the base as we're drawing back, it's not sliding up our hand. The second thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that the neck of that release, where we're getting to the trigger or where the trigger is lining up. So some of them have a straight trigger bar, some of them have a swept back or kind of a curved trigger like what you would see on a lot of handguns or rifles. That trigger needs to be able to rest to where it's coming into the finger here and not way out here. We don't want to use the tip of our finger on a wrist strap release. And the reason we don't want to do that is because the tips of our fingers are highly, highly sensitive, and it just makes a way to have target panic or some anticipation, some issues like that start coming up. So we want to make sure that we can wrap that trigger around and kind of keep it in the second finger bed right here would be my best recommendation for you. And then whenever we're set up like that, we want to make sure that whether it's the neck of the release, it's metal, you can adjust it on there however that is, or if it's a cord, you can adjust that cord. But we want to find a wrist strap release that has that adjustment and gives us the ability to be able to put that and wrap our finger around it. I also recommend when you're looking into wrist straps, get one that is of good enough quality to be able to have an adjustable trigger of some form. Some of them are internally adjusted where you use a screw and you can adjust that and kind of adjust the pressures on it. Some of them have springs and you can change the spring tension out or adjust that. Do something to where you can have it to where you want to make sure that you have enough confidence that you can wrap your finger into that trigger and preload a little bit of pressure into that trigger without being afraid that that arrow is going to fire. That preload and putting our finger in there when we start talking about shot execution makes it way easier, whether you're going to just pull through the shot, whether you're going to slowly squeeze the trigger or whatever you may be doing. That preload being there to start with actually helps out a ton. Going from there into a thumb release, You will see some things carry over on all three of these releases. In my opinion, having your hand flat on the back of it with a wrist strap, a thumb release, or a hinge release is all going to be the most easiest way to have repeatability from one shot to the next. Whenever we're doing this, we don't want to have these base knuckles on our hand. We don't want them curved up here, and we don't want them stretched too far out. We also want to make sure that we're putting the release in this row of our knuckles. The majority of people, that's going to be the best place for it. Some need to adjust that back and forth, and some will do different than that. But you can see if you start getting too deep into that release, it starts to curve the hand and have some problems. And then if it's too far out, you're going to have a lot of tension in your hand normally to be able to hold on to this release and not slip and let it come out. I recommend doing this and getting a nice good hook around it and keeping our hand flat on the back when we're using it. Pressures going into this release. So there's different thoughts on this, and what I will say is find out what is most comfortable for you. I shot a hinge release for so long that when I use a thumb release, I still put my thumb on the edge of this right here, and I draw back with still a lot of pressure on my index and my thumb and not a ton of pressure on my middle finger and ring finger. Now, some people will say that that is incorrect and you need to have even pressure against all three fingers. I think that if you're just starting out, if you have even pressure against all your fingers, you're drawing, you're getting into anchor, it is probably a good place to start, and it is pretty safe to draw a hinge or a thumb button rather back that way and keep your thumb away from that trigger. So whenever we're using this, we want to make sure, just like what we were doing with the wrist strap release, that we're setting up our trigger on our thumb here to be able to get our thumb onto the trigger safely. We need to have enough tension built up on here to where we can preload some pressure into that barrel and not worry about the shot firing. That's super important. Everything that we have preloading on that pressure of that trigger allows us to increase that later on, and it helps our shot sequence so much. So make sure that you're able to do that. And also, I will say the same is what I did for the index release. We want to adjust this thumb barrel when we're at anchor to where we're not way out here with just the tip of our thumb on this thumb barrel. I think you have too much ability to be able to get snappy with it and too much ability to be able to have a lot of feel and create some issues later on. For me personally, I like to take this crease that is in my thumb, and that gets put on the bottom side of this trigger when I'm at anchor, and then I can wrap my thumb around it. For me, the way that my thumb is built, this pad right here, that's my preload of wrapping around it, and I can feel a little bit of a pressure build up on it. That's what I'm looking for. When we're using a thumb release, it's pretty important to not have a super relaxed hand. When we have too much relaxation on our hand with a thumb release, if we're here and we start to try to make that barrel move and increase the pressure, we can rotate the thumb release, and then sometimes that's creating some problems and we start hanging up on that release. So with this thumb release, we don't want to death grip it, but it is a good idea to keep pretty good tension on the fingers, especially to be able to have the outer fingers work with you and be able to fire that release. All right, looking at a hinge release. This is the one that's going to have the most options on how you fire it, how you get set up, and the way that you're using it. So first of all, click or no click. A lot of people fight with this and a lot of people look at this. For me, I like to use a click. And the way that you need to be using a click, if you are having one set up, is a way to be able to verify that you're in the correct position as you're anchoring, and also that you have the correct hand pressures on the release or finger pressures on the release. It's a starting point of the shot. It is not part of shot execution. If you are using a click as part of your shot execution, it's going to create jumps mid-shot when you're pulling through and you get to that click, you're going to have a bobble in your sight picture normally, and then it can create some anticipation issues. They make different sizes of the shelf for the click, so once you get to there and then it goes over that shelf to allow you to have the execution of the release, those are different lengths. I personally like a shorter shelf length. I like to be able to get into anchor, have it click. I don't want to have to move a ton through that release to fire my shot. So if you have a release like this True Ball Fulcrum Flex, that was a mouthful. You actually can buy different clicks, the moons, the half moons that go in there, you have different clicks and you can set those up. If you have a release that has an adjustable moon, like the UV hinge, the hinge 2, some Carter releases, total control releases like that, you can actually micro tune how you want that click to be. Those are really helpful as well. So it just kind of comes down to personal preference on what you want to do and what feels best in the hand. Main thing that I will say with a hinge release, no matter if it's a 2-finger, a 3-finger, or a 4-finger hinge, is we want to be able to use what I call positive rotation. Positive rotation means that there's rotation left in this release naturally without us needing to induce very much tension or pressure into the release in order to rotate it enough to trip that release and fire the arrow. Using positive rotation is just a way of having a free step on steady aim. So all that steady aim that we've created with our form and our stabilizers and our fitment and the way that we're aiming and everything we're doing, we're not having to induce a lot of extra pressure with these hinge releases as long as we still have some of that travel left in them. Now, I will caution most people from running really hot, and when I say really hot, the release is tilted this direction and it doesn't require much movement at all to fire it, because a lot of the times you're too index heavy and it just creates a way for you to hang up with the release, so it's hard to fire and it's harder for you to be able to relax and go through it. What I recommend when you are drawing a hinge back and when you are shooting one, keep the majority of the pressure on your index finger, a small amount on the thumb, and not much pressure at all on these outer fingers. And we're drawing them back with a relaxed index. That's the big thing there. You don't want to have a really tight grip and a fist on that hinge release. A lot of people do that when they first get one because they're afraid of it releasing early and getting punched in the face. Use a string trainer. If you have one like mine, you can build one out of just taking a piece of string or paracord and just making it the right length for you so that you can work on getting these adjusted, drawing back, getting into anchor, and being able to feel that release as to how much pressure and how much rotation is in it in order for it to fire. It's the safest way to do any kind of release when you're setting it up. Now, the reason I like to have a relaxed index is I like for that release to feel like it's pulling into the fingers and taking a little bit of slack out as I'm drawing it back, because then when I start to execute my shot, I have a softer index and it's allowing that hinge to rotate. These hinges have to rotate in order to fire. It's the only way they're gonna work. So when we're setting that speed up and we're getting to the click, we wanna be able to get our arm in a good position. We wanna build a little bit of pre-tension into our outer fingers, whichever ones you have on that release. And that pre-tension into those outer fingers is just like what we talked about on our thumb releases and our index releases of preloading a trigger. So we're doing the same thing. This hinge release is a trigger. The trigger mechanism is the rotation. So we want to preload a little bit of tension into it, but again, not take up so much that we are taking all the rotation out of the hinge. We still want to be able to preload, and then if we were to relax our index finger or work through by pulling and creating a little bit of rotation and a squeeze into the release, whatever we're doing with it, we want to have some of that left over to where we're not having to over rotate the release and induce a lot of tension back into our shot. Now, last thing that I'm going to talk about is anchor position for all three of these releases. It's really simple with a thumb release and a hinge release. The handheld releases are all anchoring the same way. On a index release, what I like to do is I like to take this base knuckle on my hand and I dig it into this part of my neck. There's like a little crevice here on the top of my jawbone into my ear, and I just bury it in there. That allows me to get in here to anchor pretty well, and then I can get my finger wrapped around. It keeps everything in a line. I don't want my hand too far up on my face, and I don't want it too low on my neck, because that kind of creates an imbalance in the straight line that we're doing, and it can cause you to pull up or down on the D loop, and then you can see some issues with your aim on target. With a handheld release, this is the one in the way that I talk to a lot of people, and it's an aha moment. It's something they've never thought about. Maybe they've never been told this, but it works really well for the majority of archers and people that I work with. And it's when we anchor, we are actually using these middle knuckles as our touch point on our jawline. We're not using the base knuckles. And the reason I tell people that is these base knuckles, if you are set up with a D-loop that is long enough for you to have the correct leverage over the bow and to have the best hold that you can on target, majority of the time, these base knuckles are beyond the jaw. And that's where a lot of people run into problems. They don't feel like they can anchor correctly because their hand is too far back and they feel like they're floating. But if you are using these middle set of knuckles on the jaw, just like what you would normally do, but it's here on the jaw, top and bottom, we are splitting this jawline. And what I like to do is I like to take this part of my knuckle into the very bottom part of the bone on my jaw. And that's a good place for me to start out with. It's a good location for my hand, and it allows me to then, when I'm shooting longer distances with a slider sight, I can either move my hand down a little bit, or I can slack and relax and open my mouth and my jaw, and it allows my hand to stay in the same spot on that bone and come down a little bit and help compensate for my aim. That is actually a tip that I got from John Dudley on one of his videos. I'd never used that before. I started using that, and that's my preferred method. But that is something I wanted to go over with these releases, because I think that that's going to help a lot of people for two reasons. One is to help them stay connected and have good positive contact on their jaw. And then also the other part is, if we're trying to use these base knuckles on our jaw, a lot of the times we start bending our wrist and we create some problems where we're pulling the release away from our face, and we have some other issues with alignment and some anchor. We lose some of the steadiness on target. All right, in segment 2, we're going to be talking about 2-finger, 3-finger, and 4-finger handheld releases. You've seen me shoot a 2-finger hinge and thumb buttons for a long time. If you've watched my videos, you've heard me talk about them, and you know that I'm a huge believer in it when it comes to a hinge release. For me, I think the most simplest way of shooting a release and keeping torque off of it and allowing yourself to get a solid anchor is with just using a 2-finger release like this. These are the only 2 fingers that I would ever use anyways with the hinge. Even when I tried 3-finger releases with the hinge release or a 4-finger hinge release, it just didn't work for me. Now, your mileage may vary and you may be different. You may need the extra leverage on the outside of that release, but keep in mind that when you are adding fingers to the release on the opposite side of your index and thumb, that is a leverage point on that release. A lot of people most commonly use a 3-finger release. That is what most people are comfortable with and most people like to use. It's very similar to if you ever shot a recurve, you use 3 fingers to pull it back, whether it's 3 under or you're splitting with the index and the middle finger, whatever it may be. That's what most people are using. They carry that over to a handheld release as well. It is very comfortable, but when I was using a 3-finger release with a hinge, for me anyways, I was only using my middle finger to work that release. So keep that in mind. Now, I'm not marrying myself to that theory forever. I still dabble with trying 3-finger releases and 4 in thumb and with the hinge release. So whatever works best for you, track your scores and find out what you need. Be able to see the grouping size or the scoring or whatever it is, test them all. Now, when you are using 2-finger versus a 3 or a 4-finger release, you will have to adjust the speeds a little bit when you're testing and trying in between. When you're using a 2-finger release, naturally you will pull more on this index finger and you won't rotate the release as much at anchor. So you'll have to have it set up a little bit hotter, a little bit faster with less rotation needed. As we start adding those fingers on, your hand rotates the release a little bit more. It needs to slow down. So again, have a string trainer or one you've built, test those out before you take it to your bow so it's a little bit safer for you. Bonus, if you can get, and I'm a big proponent of this, but if you can get a release like these true ball releases that have the extra finger attachments on here, all of these finger attachments, as you can see here, they have lines that allow you to adjust these extra 3 and 4-finger releases a little bit further forward or backwards. Again, this is a way for one, to match the hand shape that you have. Everybody has a natural hand shape. And 2, the amount of leverage you want to induce on a release because of how much pressure you need on the outside of it. So it's almost like what we were talking about prior with the positive rotation allowed in that release. It's almost a way to add into that system and allow it to work. When it comes to a thumb button release, I dabble with 2-finger, but for me, it doesn't ever seem like I can get enough leverage on the thumb button in order to fire my shot consistently and have the least amount of input possible for me to get the best scoring downrange. So I go back and forth. I usually shoot a 4-finger style thumb release. I like a lot of extra leverage on my thumb releases. That's something that I started out a long time ago with the Carter release, and it always felt comfortable, and I usually move that over. Recently started testing out with just 3 fingers on a release, because one thing that I did find with 4-finger releases is there's a little bit more tension in the back of my hand and in the palm, and I get a little bit more induced movement sometimes, especially when I'm under pressure, when I'm trying to execute a shot with a thumb release. So again, I think that's a big reason why these 3-finger releases are so popular, because you can relax the outer parts of your hand here and here, whether it's a thumb release or a hinge release, and allows you to be able to shoot those. So test those out, try both, see what works best for you. And if you have the ability with a lot of these new releases to be able to do that pretty easily, take advantage of that. In our third segment today, we're finally going to be talking about release execution methods. Now remember, there will be a bonus tip after this, so stick around for that at the end of this segment. So let's start out and let's talk about, essentially, with all 3 styles of releases, one method you can use for all of them, whether it's an index style, a thumb button, or a hinge release. A slow squeeze on the triggers or on the release, or a combination of both, will work on all 3 releases, and a ton of archers I've noticed are using that method. Me personally, that is what I am most comfortable with. When I was shooting an index style release, I would always have a slow squeeze into that trigger or a curl of the finger around the trigger, however you really want to use as a focal point and think of it. And then when I moved over to a thumb button and a hinge release, I struggled with people telling me you had to pull through the shot without manipulating the release, created myself an issue with target panic, and just had an overall horrible time with a handheld release early on. So I'm here to tell you that it is okay to manipulate that release, but we need to do it correctly. And what I will say is a slow, steady motion from the time that we start our execution until the time the shot breaks, no matter how you're doing that, is the best way to do this. We need to be able to separate our aim and our hold on target from our execution of our shot, and not start and stop on the execution while we are aiming on target. Now, if you have a windy condition, if you have something that feels off and you need to stop, I would say, if possible, let down and start over. That's my recommendation, especially when we're learning these methods and working through them and starting with them. It's probably best if you're able to. This is one of those times where I am a proponent of blank bailing, not shooting at a target face, and just having a target up close that you can shoot into. Everything that I say that we need to work on form or shot execution or whatever it is, I recommend having a target somewhere between our shoulder and our face height, so that we're aiming level and not imparting any kind of bad habits, and we're not having to lean back or forward or do anything crazy on target. So a slow squeeze on a thumb release for me looks like preloading tension into the button, like what we talked about with that crease in the front of my thumb pad, and then literally just working that button like this. Now, this is an over exaggeration, it's not going to fire, but literally just working the button. Now, you might find that it's better for you to preload tension into that trigger and slowly squeeze the outer fingers on the release, or a combination of squeezing outer fingers and thumb together. What you also may find is that not using any of the fingers on the release is best for you, and you get some tension in a finger that's not on the release and curl it. That can also help as well. For me, I notice that when I try to relax my hand or yield or do something to where I'm relaxing with the thumb release, my thumb relaxes too. So that means that there's not enough pressure on there and it's never gonna fire. So you can do a slow squeezing method, or you can preload the trigger and continually push and pull. That will also work as well. Some people just push to the target, some people just pull away from the target. What I will say is that make sure your bow shoulder is not extending towards the target if you are pushing, or pulling itself up into your neck and towards your spine if you were just pulling. Make sure this is locked in place. If you were pushing, it's elbow out, not wrist out, and not shoulder out. And if you were just pulling, let this lock itself into place and just pull against the tension. But whatever you're doing, slow and steady is how you need to accomplish this, because if we are imparting too much tension or too quick, it's going to interrupt what we're seeing on our shot execution downrange. So when we are using a hinge release, we can use a lot of these same methods, but with a little bit of an exception on how we do them to begin with. Like I said before, on a hinge, we want to have a soft index when we're drawing and getting back to anchor. And then from that point, you can squeeze the outer fingers that aren't on the release, or what I've even found, actually what I used in league the other night, was just using my outer fingers was not cutting it for me. It was messing with my brain a little bit, and it just wasn't working as smoothly as I wanted. And I actually started squeezing my index and my middle finger on the release at the same time. I have looked at this because at the time it didn't make sense to me. I'm squeezing my index, it should hang it up. But if I curl these fingers together, because the way that the outer part of my hand is, these fingers start taking up faster than my index. I was actually still allowing the rotation of the release to happen and still firing. But you do have to be soft on the index no matter what you're doing. There is a different way to shoot these hinge releases that some people like to use, and that is a relaxation of the index to where it rotates the hinge with just using our index. The way that I will describe this and recommend it to you is a little bit different than how it was described to me. But when I was told to relax my index, I started relaxing and almost pointing that index out. And when I was doing that, the bow is going forward, the string rather is going forward. It's creeping, I'm losing tension against the back wall, and my aim started to drop. For me personally, the way that I would interpret this now is yielding against a buildup of extra pressure pulling into the back wall of the bow. So essentially what we're doing on this is we are pulling a little bit with our hand and with our arm, and when we are doing that, we are just letting that index relax a little bit, or the back of our hand here relax a little bit on these base knuckles through our wrist area right here as we're pulling. So we're maintaining a steady pressure against the back wall, we're maintaining our aim on target, but as we increase that distance and that pressure buildup, we're just letting our hand give to it slightly so that that release is firing. With a resistance style release, it's pretty straightforward. You're gonna wanna hold it like you do a thumb button, where we're not relaxed on our hands. We don't wanna lose the tension on it. We don't need to induce rotation on it like we do with a hinge release. On a resistance style release, it's a very good training tool for you to start feeling a slow, steady increase on pressure. You just need to be able to pull and feel like that scapula is kind of rotating and moving back over to your spine, and your elbow is rotating back around. When we're using any style of release, a resistance, a hinge, a thumb, or an index release, what I recommend is finding focal points. And what I mean by focal points is whatever method we're using, we're giving a direction for that energy to go. So I'm gonna use a hinge release as an example for me. I like to use my middle finger to slowly squeeze on that release and rotate that release. But when I'm doing that, I'm thinking about my middle finger pulling into the palm of my hand towards my wrist. That allows me to be able to pull in a straight motion to where when my shot breaks, I'm coming back, and normally I end up back here on the top of my shoulder, and it's a steady and a straight path. It keeps me from popping out away from my face or digging in too hard and creating problems. When I use the thumb release, I do kind of the same thing, but I'm using my thumb and I start thinking about pulling it through the hand, through the forearm. You may be different. You may need to think your elbow is pulling to a spot behind you. Make it a straight line spot behind you. You may need to think that you're pulling the release away from the target and pulling that release to maybe the top of your shoulder, or just pulling it through your hand, through your wrist, or pulling the release to your elbow. Try to find something with a straight line, test different methods, and use this as a way to find a focal point to give you a direction for that energy and give you a direction for the motion to go. That was why I kind of go back to when people were telling me to relax my index in order to rotate a hinge, and I started pointing my finger out or feeling like I was in reference, but I was losing my string and coming forward and losing my good aim because I wasn't taking up slack while I was doing this. So even with that method, I'm finding a focal point and pulling through and allowing myself to be able to see what's happening on target and work through it. One thing that I will say that does work for me pretty well too is a tip that I heard Steve Anderson talk about on a World Archery announcer booth segment that he had. I think is where I heard it from. It's been years now. But he said he was taught to think that there's a string in the middle of the target that runs through the bow, through the arrow, into the release hand, through your elbow, and you are trying to pull that in a straight line away from the target, and you're trying to keep tension on that string so it doesn't get slack, and you're trying to just pull it out of the target. And that's what works best for him. So again, it's just a focal point in order for you to be able to find something to focus on and start working it through. Main thing that I will say is study your float while you're doing this. If you can become what I like to say is like a passenger, almost like you're just watching things happen and getting bored with your shot, that usually works best. When I start overthinking about what I'm doing with my release hand, I start losing focus on my aim and what I'm holding on target with, and that's where I start seeing my problems for me. I get too focused on that execution, some target panic, or really just anticipation of the shot starts happening, and that becomes a problem. Now, one more thing that I will say with release execution, your brain, your subconscious will get used to whatever release you're using, whether it's the speed of the hinge or the pressure on a thumb trigger. If you are an archer that's lucky enough to have multiple releases, maybe even 2 or whatever releases of the exact same kind, you can set them up with different speeds. You may set them up as a 2, a 3, or a 4 finger in different methods. You can be using a thumb button with an extra thumb button as well that you can have set up a little bit harder on the tension of the trigger, and or what I like to do is switch back and forth between the two. Something to keep your brain kind of guessing and kind of working. And I don't always, like I'm not saying shoot one shot and switch to another release, or shoot one day and then switch to another release the next day. But when I start noticing that my body is anticipating when the shot's supposed to happen with my hinge release and it's starting to become a problem, I will grab my thumb release and I will shoot some arrows with it. Sometimes it may just be, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 arrows, and then I can go back to my hinge release and I'm good again. Same thing if I'm using my thumb release as my primary release, I may need to go to a hinge release and just start doing something different. But don't be afraid to, if you only have one release, to adjust the speeds or adjust the tension on the thumb trigger. Just mark it and know where you're at. I'm a big proponent of marking everything as a fail-safe. I even mark the position of where I like this button to be. So if it gets moved, or if I want to move it to test out another location, I can. Same thing with the hinge release. Most of these are going to have a dial indicator now. If they don't, whenever you're putting your adjustment tool in there, just know where it started and how much you're turning it. Make a note of it in your phone, on your notes, or in a notebook, or wherever you want to put it so you can go back to that if you need to. But really just a small turn to make something slightly faster or slower, or a harder trigger or a softer trigger. Honestly, just a slight amount of difference will help trick your brain and help keep you from getting used to everything that way. Or pick a whole new shot method and do it that way, which honestly I'm in favor of, because I don't use the same one. I mean, there's times where I don't use the same one from one shot to the next if I just need to have something different, especially in different days or different pressure situations, things like that. Sometimes my normal primary way of shooting a release just won't work for me that day for some reason. I may need to switch to another one. So test them all out and get as comfortable as you can with all of them. You'll find your primary one that works best for you, but knowing what the other ones feel like and being able to call an audible and going to one of those other release methods will help you a lot in certain situations. All right, guys, bonus tip. Today, I'm gonna give you an idea of what we're looking at with our follow through. So for me, I go back and forth with worrying too much about follow through and looking too much into it. I don't think you really need to be too concerned with trying to force or make your follow through look a certain way. I know a lot of people do this. They want some outcome and they will force themselves to do that in one direction or the other. But I will say that if we're watching what happens after the shot, it will give us an indication of what was happening right before the shot broke. You'll see sometimes where archers pull their arm way up on target, or they're pushing it off to the sides or dropping it and just letting it come down. You may even see with their release hand, they're coming up away from their face this way or coming back normally in different ways. So keep in mind that if you are moving, sometimes your subconscious saw that you needed to move, or maybe you're forcing yourself to try to move and you're overcompensating and you are giving that bow too much direction and flying off target after the shot. If that is happening, then that is something you need to look for. Me personally, my breakdown I know that I have is sometimes I will try to end the shot early. And that's me getting too used to how much I'm putting pressure into a button or how much I'm rotating a hinge. Or if the shot is taking longer than normal, I give up on it and my bow hand will drop down and my arm will drop. So I know that if I get into those situations, I will start focusing a little bit more on follow through, and I will force myself to hold my arm up on target and stand still after the shot breaks for like a count of 1 in my head. And I'm forcing myself to maintain this position so that I'm not ending the shot early and trying to go away from it or giving up on it. Another one is too of peeking or moving your head around or doing something like that and causing some issues. So watch what's happening. If you need to video yourself or have somebody watch you, that's a really good way to handle this. Again, at League the other day, I actually had an archer next to me that noticed that my stabilizer right before my shot would break would start wiggling really bad. And it was just a comment that he made to me walking down to the target to pull our arrows. He said, "Man, you must be pulling the heck out of your bow tonight." And I didn't realize it, but I was hanging up on an index finger with my hinge, and there was too much tension there and it was causing me problems. So as soon as he said that, I thought, okay, my follow through is telling me what's going on because that shot is wiggling a lot right at the shot break. And then I'm there and I could feel it. I wasn't really realizing what was happening, but sometimes the bow, when I was coming out, it was torquing a little bit this way or that way, very slightly. So if I was not letting the bow jump towards the target, I was inputting a little bit into it because I was just tensing up everywhere. So keep a lookout for that, or feel it, or hopefully somebody sees it if you're not videoing or whatever is going on. But being able to judge what's happening on the follow through is a really good key indicator of, are we shooting a shot correctly or are we not? Personally, if I have a perfect follow through, my hand comes out and it gets right over the edge of my shoulder and I almost drop down and touch it usually. And then my arm will stay up here on target and it never moves. And the bow just jumps towards the target and then dips down. That's perfect for me. Everybody else is different. Just find out what works best for you and know what that looks and feels like so that you can try to repeat that from one shot to the next. All right, this is a massively long video, I'm sure. Just filming it, I know that there was a lot of time, but I appreciate you all for watching it. This is the conclusion of our shot execution series, and I wanted to make sure that I pretty much lay it all out on the line here. Our members video will have a little bit of extra tip on top of what we already talked about, but it's going to be very minute on this week's video. I wanted to give as much information as I could on shot execution to everybody, whether you are a paid member of this channel or just a normal member. One thing that I will ask though is if you aren't subscribed to this channel, please think about going ahead and doing so. And if you are subscribed to this channel, make sure that you have the bell notifications turned on so that you see when the video posts every week. I try to do these as live premieres as much as possible so that I'm there to chat with or talk with in the middle of it. But that way it notifies you when they hit and you can be able to see it, because some weeks I try to get them out around 11 or 12 Central Time, but it does vary sometimes depending on work schedule and what's going on in my life. But this next video series is over tuning the bow and what that looks like. I've got some new strings going on my bow, and I'm going to use that as a way to be able to film some of my tuning process, what I think is important, what I think is not important, and let you see, at least from a target standpoint, what I'm doing with the bow. Appreciate you watching this video, sharing them, liking them, subscribing to the channel, or being a member of the channel. I thank y'all very much. It helps a ton. It allows me to be able to replace string trainers when they break so that I can use them in videos like this, or be able to give feedback to y'all and say, hey, would you like to see me test certain products? So it means a lot. But I appreciate it, guys. Thank you again. I'll see you soon.